to it. Got a couple more people. All right. Hi. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. I'm sure we're going to have some people come in after we get started here in a bit. We want to go ahead at 6 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our Teaching with Primary Sources webinar. We're very thrilled to have you join us. My name is Dr. Tina Ellsworth, and I'm an assistant professor of education at Northwest Missouri State University. And I'm also the director of the Teaching with Primary Sources program at Northwest Missouri State. The Teaching with Primary Sources program is funded by a grant from the Library of Congress. Their Teaching with Primary Sources program, content that's created and featured in partnership with the Teaching with Primary Sources program does not necessarily indicate an endorsement by the Library of Congress, but we are very grateful to have received support from the library to make these programs available. Our program runs October 1 of 2024 through September 30 of 2025 and features 3 two-day workshops for PK-16 educators. Our first one was in Maryville, Missouri in December. Our second was in Topeka, Kansas in January, and our last one is slated for the first week of April in Platte City, Missouri. Teachers who participate will receive a stipend for their participation in the workshop, as well as creating lessons that feature sources from the Library of Congress. And at our workshops, teachers learn a host of new ways to teach with primary sources in new and engaging ways. Our program also features webinars with expert educators, and we have an incredible program lined up. We had our very first one on February 10th of 2025 called Teaching Through a Local Lens with Dr. Alyssa Ford. She's a professor of history at Northwest Missouri State University, and you can get a copy of that video on our YouTube channel. Today, March 17th, is Bringing Oral Histories to Life using Picture Books and Primary Source Investigations with Rachel Swearengin, who's a 5th grade teacher. April 7th, which is just a couple weeks away, Valencia Abbott is going to take us through History in Our Backyard, Amplifying Rural Histories Through Inquiry and Primary Sources. She's a high school social studies teacher. And then lastly, on May 5th, we have Ethics, Access, and Historical Thinking, conducting oral history work with students in rural communities with Rory Dunn, who is a PhD candidate at Virginia Commonwealth University. Now, you can sign up for all of these webinars by going to our website, which I'll drop in the chat here in a minute. All webinars are free and are open to the public. We also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to get the earliest information about our upcoming events, as well as tips for teaching with primary sources. We're also going to use this newsletter to keep you abreast of what might be coming up in the fall. So if you want to be first in on that, you can scan that QR code or type in that bit.ly at the bottom of your screen to sign up, and you will be the first to know all the goods. So tonight is the second webinar in our series for this year, featuring Mrs. Rachel Swearengin from Manchester Park Elementary School in Olathe, Kansas. But before we introduce Rachel and tell you a little bit about her and her session tonight, we want to hear from you. We have a small group tonight, so we'd love to hear from each of you. Who are you and what drew you into this webinar tonight? Who would like to go first? Feel free to just unmute.
I am Julie Fishburne. I'm from Olathe, and I work with social studies in the district. And I am a huge fan of Rachel Swearengin, and I'm so excited to be here to learn all about the cool things that she has to share today about teaching with primary sources.
Excellent. Thanks, Julie. I'm a big fan of Rachel and Julie too. Okay. How about Justin?
I actually just saw your announcement pop up on my Facebook feed this afternoon, and I was like, "Oh, cool!" And I've been reading Rachel's book, so I'm excited.
Very nice. Justin, where do you teach?
I'm from Houston, Texas. I'm a coordinator for K through 12 social studies in Humble ISD.
Excellent. Well, it's nice to meet you, Justin. We're really glad you're here. Nichelle.
I'm trying to connect. Anyway, hi, I'm Nichelle Pinckney. I am Kate. I'm a K through 12 social studies coordinator in Texas, like 30 miles from Justin, maybe. I don't know how far it is from you, Justin.
Excellent. What drew you to the session today, Michelle?
Well, I adore Tina, and I was super excited about elementary primary resources because I want to do a big training on it soon. And I was like, okay, how do I start with this? And I had blank pages, and then I saw this, and I was like, we'll totally do this.
Yes, very good. Well, it's good to see you too.
Good to see
Uh,
you too.
let's see, Mila, where are you from and what drew you to the session?
Hi, I am from Kansas City. I am a student at Northwest, and I am student teaching right now. So I'm just looking to learn more about teaching social studies in the early years.
Excellent. What grade are you currently student teaching in?
I'm with first grade.
Wonderful. Well, we're really glad you're here. Kaylin, what about you?
Hey, um, my name is Kaylin. I teach third grade in Kearney, which is like 25, 30 minutes from Kansas City. It's my second year teaching, but I would love to integrate a lot more primary sources in my social studies content. We started working through PBLs, and so um, yeah, and I also had Tina for a professor a couple years ago, and she really touched on my heart about social studies, and so I'm just really excited to learn a lot more.
Oh, we're so glad that each of you are here. And as I mentioned earlier, one aspect of our program is to offer webinars to help teachers learn more about teaching with primary sources. And so tonight, we are pleased to present to you a brilliant educator who has done incredible work engaging students with inquiry and primary sources. As Justin had mentioned earlier, Rachel is the author of a book called Making Time for Social Studies, a four-step process for unit planning in the elementary classroom. She currently teaches fifth grade in Olathe, Kansas, and serves as a field educator for the Humanities Department for the Kansas State Department of Ed, where she facilitates professional development and serves on assessment and planning committees. She's also an adjunct professor for Emporia State, where she teaches elementary social studies methods to undergrads. She is a 2023 recipient of the Gilder Lehrman Kansas Teacher of the Year Award, as well as one of the top finalists for the 2023 Gilder Lehrman National History Teacher of the Year Award. She's very passionate about teaching effective social studies in the elementary classroom and to prepare even our youngest learners for their roles as productive citizens in a democracy. So tonight, Rachel, a veteran elementary teacher, is going to introduce participants to the process of pairing historical sources with informational texts, and she will highlight how various types of primary sources and children's picture books can be combined to engage learners in exploring rural histories and developing historical thinking. And if at any point you have a question, you can drop it in the chat. Rachel and I will be managing that. But for right now, everyone, please help me welcome Miss Rachel Swearengin.
Thank you so much, Tina. I will say what Kaylin said. I think I gained my passion for social studies from Tina, so I'm very grateful that she's given me the opportunity to share with you tonight. These are two of my favorite topics, picture books and primary sources. And it was really fun for me to think about how some of the sources I already use are connected to rural histories. And then also, I was able to go out and find some new things that I'm really excited to share with you and eventually share with my own students. So, to get us started this evening, we're going to begin with a piece of art that's related to our topic and use a visual thinking strategy. So, the strategy that we're going to use is called the 30-second look. And I'm going to show you the piece of art, and then we're just going to take 30 seconds to just observe the art. I don't want you to take any notes, write anything down. You don't need to put anything in the chat at this point. You're just going to observe. So here is the art, 30 seconds. Okay. So now what I'd like you to do is make note of your observations. You can write them down, but I'd like for you to choose several of them that you'd be willing to enter into the chat. Just something that you noticed in that piece of art.
You want us to go ahead and put it in the chat now or wait?
Yes, you can go ahead and put it in the chat. People are noticing the people and what they look like, maybe even how they're feeling. They look happy. What they're doing. So we've noticed objects, we've noticed actions, we've noticed people. And I'm wondering at this point, was there something that your colleagues noticed that you didn't? As the chat was scrolling by there, did you think, oh, I missed that, or I didn't see that? Or maybe you interpreted something differently than somebody else. So one thing that this strategy does is it encourages students to look at the details of whatever the artwork is that you're thinking about. And because we're using it in a group, you're getting to hear the ideas of other people. So it's building on your own. Yeah, so people missed, Julie said, I missed the dandelion. I didn't see the letter that was in the girl's hand. What do you think about the fact that some of the people are looking up? Did you notice that? Some of the people are looking up into the sky. It does look like a giant pencil. That's what I thought the first time I saw it too. What the farmer's holding. Yeah, maybe he's got his hand up in the air, right? He's praising God. Yep, I love that.
At
So
first I thought maybe a tornado was coming, but then I thought they don't look like scared enough
because
or
the other people in
something.
the background aren't even noticing whatever it is they're looking at, right? Maybe rain is coming. So this particular painting, as you can see, is called Kansas Farming. It is on display at the U.S. Courthouse in Wichita, and it was actually made in 1935, between 1935 and 1936. Richard Haynes was hired to paint this, and the purpose was to depict some of the various aspects of the economic growth of the region that was happening at the time. And the artist chose to focus on rural life and farm production, specifically related to urbanization, industrialization, and technology. So some of the interesting features of this painting, because there's the foreground things that are happening, and then as you continue to look at the painting, your eyes kind of drawn to the background. But you can see the rolling hills that are ripe with the bounty of the fall harvest in the background. There's also a farmer on horseback that's visiting his neighbors. There's the young girl that holds the mail in both hands because there's actually an unseen mail plane that they see bringing the mail. The farmer is feeding his hog and looks toward a group of produce packers on the left side of the canvas. And then in the distant background, there's a small town with a railroad depot and a grain elevator. There's more around the photo than just this part of the painting. So think about how you could use this strategy in your classroom or with the educators that you support. How could you encourage them to use another piece of art maybe they already have in their curriculum or that goes along with their content, and you could use 30-second look. The purpose of it, again, is to get students to notice details and to draw their eye into beyond just what you see immediately, which is usually the people, and notice the details around. And again, because we used collaboration and we looked at it all together and shared, you're able to build on each other's ideas and bring a different perspective. You notice things that the other people around you didn't. Or maybe you could think about how you could specifically use this painting. Does it connect to some aspect of your curriculum in some way? So that draws us into our agenda for this evening. As we warmed up with a primary source, we're going to answer two questions: why use primary sources, but also why pair primary sources with picture books. We're going to look at 3 more primary source analysis strategies. And then I'm going to show you some specific picture books that are related to rural histories that you can pair with the primary sources and the strategies that we're going to be looking at. Several of the picture books are related to Kansas content, just because that's where we are. And then another one deals with a topic that can be connected to no matter what area of rural America your area connects to. So the first question of the evening is, why should we use primary sources? And one of the main reasons is because it develops historical thinking skills. And this is just one short list of the historical thinking skills that primary sources encourage. They're sourcing, contextualizing, close reading, corroborating, which you may recognize those for if you're familiar with the Digital Inquiry Group, formerly known as SHEG. But historical thinking also helps us think about multiple perspectives, continuity and change over time, as well as chronological thinking. And the reason why I chose this short list is because these are some of the skills that you'll notice we'll be practicing with the primary sources we look at tonight, along with the picture books. But I also want to point out another set of skills and why we should use primary sources that comes from Tom Bober, who, if you're unfamiliar with him, he's a librarian outside of St. Louis who does a lot of work with primary sources. He actually did a teacher residency at the Library of Congress. He's the author of a book called The Elementary Educator's Guide to Primary Sources, and he offers a lot of strategies for teaching with primary sources. Highly recommend that book. But here are some other reasons why he states we should use primary sources. First of all, many state and district standards documents include using and analyzing primary sources. It's one of the main skills of social studies. Number 2, it's a tool in inquiry. The C3 framework, which comes from the National Council for Social Studies, identifies inquiry in their inquiry design model. And one of the steps of inquiry is interacting with primary sources. Another reason to use primary sources is because of how engaging they are. Think about the activity that we just did. It draws everybody in, whether you're in kindergarten, whether you're 50 years old, right? Because you want to see the details and find out what's going on. And it enables everyone to engage with the source, because probably most of us had never seen that or didn't know what was going on. So it creates a level playing field. So often students who are hesitant to offer ideas, maybe in ELA or in science, feel like they can share with primary sources. It also encourages deep levels of thinking. When we use primary sources, students immediately connect to other learning they have. They connect to their own lives. They come up with thought-provoking questions. I'm always amazed when I use primary sources, the questions that my kids ask and the details they notice that maybe I didn't think of. And then another key piece, which we've already touched on, is very rarely do we interact with primary sources on our own. Unless you're assessing students' use of primary sources in some way, we usually always do it in partnership with another person or a group of people. Because again, it's the building of ideas among a group. You might think of something I didn't see. You might bring a perspective or something from your background and experience that I don't have, and it allows us to look at the primary source from multiple perspectives. Another key reason, especially at the elementary level, is because of the literacy skills that primary sources build. Think about photographs or the art that we just looked at. We're building visual literacy. When we read diary accounts or newspaper articles or anything text-based, we're building foundational literacy skills. And if we examine old advertisements or commercials, we're helping our students with media literacy, which I think we would all agree is something that we need to start at even younger ages. as students are being bombarded more and more with digital literacy. So we know that we want students to develop these thinking skills, but how do we do that? And that's the meat of what we're going to talk about tonight. Because just because I put a primary source in front of my students doesn't mean that they know what to do with it. And so we have to be very explicit and purposeful in teaching them how to analyze sources. Like, for example, the 30-second look that we just did. We hope that if we do this enough, students will begin to use these strategies on their own anytime a primary source is put in front of them. So as I said, this is what the rest of our time is going to focus on. And as I stated earlier, my favorite way to use primary sources is to pair them with picture books. And I know some of you teach younger grades. Some of you work with, it sounds like, educators of all grades in your area that you work in. And what I'm going to share with you comes from a 5th grade perspective lens, because these are activities that I use with my students. But you can always take the primary source, the picture book, the strategy, and think about how you can scaffold it up or down for your students. So I'll be sharing some ideas along the way, but be thinking about what this could look like in your classroom. The other question that we were thinking about tonight is, why should we pair picture books with primary sources? And this is a quote that comes from another great source, which is the Using Inquiry Elementary Guide that's provided from NCSS. And this is a quote that was in a section that Scott Waring wrote. And he said that picture books are a great way to introduce historical topics to students. But picture books alone will not tell the full and complete story. Teachers must pair these texts with primary sources to help students learn, see, and understand. And there are many reasons to pair picture books with primary sources, but I love this quote because we do want to make sure that students learn that we don't learn history from one source, but that we need to look at multiple places to make sure we're getting the full and complete story that represents more than just one perspective on that event or time in history. The next slide shares with you some ideas from my book about how do we pair picture books with primary sources. And I usually think about it 2 ways. We can share sources before we read the book, and we can share sources after we read the book, or sometimes, as you'll see tonight, it's a combination of both. So you may want to share the primary sources before the picture book because you want students to generate questions that can be answered with details in the book. So if you have some sources that lend themselves to questions, you may want to share them before. Sometimes we analyze primary sources before because we want to compare the information. We want to see, is what we see in the sources what we're finding in the book? And that's called corroboration. Do they speak to each other and tell the same story, or give us different details? Sometimes you want to read the picture book first and interact with the primary sources afterwards to check the accuracy of the text and images in the book. It's really fun to compare sources to not only the story in a picture book, but also what the illustrator did and if they were true to primary sources as well. And you may want to analyze primary sources after the picture book just because it'll generate more questions. Maybe your primary sources have something in them that the book didn't cover, and you want to generate questions, and then students can continue to research more about the person or the event or the topic even beyond that one lesson. And then, like I said, sometimes I use them before and after. It's not just an either or, but you can do both. So we're going to get started with the first strategy that I want to share with you tonight, which is called a story before a story. In this strategy, students interact with the primary sources before they read the story to see if they can come up with the story. So there's an element of mystery with this strategy that kids usually enjoy. And just like any story that you would read has specific story elements, you would want to use those story elements as well. So as students are looking at the sources, which could be a collection of photographs, it could be newspaper articles or headings, which is what we're going to look at this evening, you want them thinking about, does this primary source give me information about who the story is about? And you'll notice that the graphic organizer on the right is what I usually provide for students, and they have to write it down. If you teach a younger grade, you could just share, you could go through the sources together and you could talk about each of these and you could do the recording. But if your students are old enough, I like to put the sources around the room. It's like a gallery walk. They can go from source to source, filling in pieces of their graphic organizer. Stories have a setting. Setting includes where and when. So you want them to look for evidence in the primary sources about the setting of the story. And then we know that settings also have a plot. Something happens in the story. Sometimes there's a problem. Sometimes that problem gets resolved. So as your students are looking at the sources, they're trying to piece together this story. So we're going to practice tonight. I'm going to show you a series of primary sources. Like I said, some are photographs, some are actually newspaper articles, excerpts and heading captions from newspaper articles. I want you to look closely at each of them. And if you had this graphic organizer in front of you, think about how you would fill it in. So here is the first primary source. It is a photograph. And the caption says, Junius Groves Wright and wife Matilda, circa 1895. So think about what this helps us understand. Is it giving us information about who is in this story? Maybe where the story takes place and even when the story takes place. Okay, here's our next source. It's actually an excerpt from a newspaper article. And there's one sentence I wanted to highlight. It says, last year, Groves produced 172,000 bushels of the finest potatoes, more than any other one man is known to raise on his own land. The next source is also a photograph, and the caption reads, the Junius G. Groves Mansion. And the final source is also from a newspaper article, but you'll notice I chose to just include the title of the article and then the subheadings that went with it. And this is a great way, this is an idea that I got from Tom Bober's book. This is a great way, especially for younger students or even students that maybe have trouble accessing the text. You can just pull out sentences or just the headings so that students don't have to read these big long articles. But this heading says, Junius G. Groves, nationally known potato king, dies. Man born in slavery migrates to Kansas where he works for 40 cents a day as farm laborer, leaves $200,000 fortune. After you look at all of the sources, then the next step is to go back to your graphic organizer and fill it in. So what I would like to invite you to do, especially if you are not familiar with the story, is what were the pieces that you put together? So you could feel free to answer any of these questions. The who, the where, the when, maybe you want to give a sentence or two about what you think the story is. And you can go ahead and put your ideas in the chat. Yes, it takes place in Kansas, so that's giving us some information about where the story takes place. How did you know that it takes place in Kansas?
Well, the first picture was a clue because it said it was from the Kansas State Historical Society, so that makes me think it must be Kansas history. Um, and obviously, by the way, I already know the story, but I'm just thinking if I didn't know.
Yes.
And then when it talked about the house in Wyandotte, and then another article set, which is a town and slash county slash area outside of Kansas City. And then wasn't there one that said something about migrating to Kansas?
Yes,
So I corroborated 3 pieces to draw the conclusion that it takes place in Kansas.
very good. And Nancy said it's a rags to riches story, and the main character is a hard worker. And Julie said Junius is a successful potato farmer in Kansas. So that's giving us the character, also the setting, and then we got a little bit of the plot there, what the story is from putting those sources together. So you're all on the right track. This is actually, I'm pairing these sources with the book No Small Potatoes, which is the story of Junius G. Groves, who was an exoduster that came to Kansas and started working on a potato farm and eventually buys his own land and becomes the Potato King, his own successful potato farm business. So we're not going to have time this evening, obviously, to read all of these picture books. But for each one, I pulled out just a few pages so I can show you as you're reading the story how you can make connections to the sources that you pulled. So on this particular page of the text, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, it talks about the fact that he was crowned the Potato King, which matches with the article that I chose that had him named as the Potato King in the article. So we're able to corroborate that source. And that same source also talked about the fact that he was born in slavery. And this particular page says that as well from the book. He was born into slavery on a plantation near Greensburg, Kentucky. And then it also talks about the fact that he didn't stay in slavery for a long, long time, because not long after he was born in 1865, slavery was abolished. Which leads us to the next part of the story, this idea that he came to Kansas because he was an exoduster, which would be additional information that we would learn. But this page in particular talks about the fact that many of the exodusters came to Kansas, including Junius Groves. And it talks about the specific places, Topeka and Kansas City, near the Kansas River, where they settled. So again, that also goes along with our primary source and the story that you came up with. And then if you look at the second paragraph, it's only 1 sentence long on this page. It talks about the fact that he landed a job on a potato farm where he was working for just 40 cents a day, which was also mentioned in the article. And this one I thought was pretty interesting because the article that I chose talked about the fact that he produced 172,000 bushels of potatoes. But yet on this page, it talks about in this particular year, he grew 72,150 bushels. So I think it would be interesting for your students if they questioned that. Is the article talking about a different year? Was this, how far into his potato farming was this? So there seems to be a little bit of discrepancy. And so your students could try to research that further and see if they can find information on what he did each year. And then a final page of the book shows a little bit of the brick mansion that he built. And I love this illustration because you can see that even the balcony that they're standing on in the illustration is made to match the way that the slats are in the balcony of the actual mansion that he built. And then it also shows his wife in this illustration, which we saw from the original photograph. Something else that primary sources do when you read a fiction book like this is show students that it's historical fiction. Yes, the pictures don't look real, an illustrator drew them, but it's based on real people and events. And when you show them the real people and events, they can see that. Anytime I use this strategy, I like to come back to all of these or a combination of these questions. How did your thinking change? Which you'll see as a theme tonight, that's one of the reasons primary sources are powerful. And when we use them before and after, it allows students to change their mind and to see that it's okay when we get more information, it's okay to change our minds. What information in the sources and the book was similar? We saw lots of similarities, but we also had a question about something that was different that we might want to research more. So what questions did we have that were answered from the beginning, but also what questions do we still have and where could we go to find the answers? And I did forget to mention, and somebody's putting lots of, she's putting lots of sources in there, but when you get the slides in the notes, the sources are all linked as well so that you can find them yourself too. So just to recap, this strategy was called Story Before a Story. So students try to tell the story of a historical event before they learn about it by studying a collection of primary sources, and then they generate questions. You read the picture book, and we go back and think about how our thinking has changed. So just take 30 seconds or so and maybe either jot it down, or if you want, you can even put it in the chat. But how are you thinking you could either use the picture book, No Small Potatoes, or maybe you have another book that A Story Before a Story might work well with, or an event that you teach that you could find sources for, that you could use in your classroom or with the educators that you support. It always is helpful for me if I jot down that idea so I don't forget it. And Justin said he could use it for his reconstruction unit. And I love that because that is beyond elementary, right? So we can use picture books even in middle school and high school. So I love that you're making that connection. Lots of civil rights movement picture books. And again, they could be used elementary, they can be used at secondary. And Nate is sharing the Hamilton read along of the story. Oh, push and pull for migration, reconstruction. And that's another great point Tina makes, that you can get quick content, but then you can really spend time on the primary sources. I love that too. Great ideas. Okay, we're going to go on to strategy number 2, which is called Circle of Viewpoints. This strategy actually comes from Project Zero, which is a collection of thinking routines out of Harvard. And this strategy is really good to use if you're talking about a person, an event, or a historical time where there are lots of different perspectives that you want students to think about. When you use this strategy, you analyze a source, you create a circle of viewpoints, which there's an example on the right, and then you add more sources so that you can see additional perspectives. So we're going to try this tonight around the event that's connected to this photograph. This photograph captures the Tractorcade protest of 1979, which was a protest by the American agriculture movement. It was also referred to as the American Agriculture Movement Rally. And in 1979, thousands of farmers from across the country drove their tractors to Washington, D.C. to protest what was going on with the agricultural industry. They wanted to lobby Congress for policy so that they could have more profitable prices for their crops. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background before we try the strategy. The first part of the strategy is to look at one or more sources. We're going to look at 2 and think about what are some reactions that different groups of people may have had to this event. So what you want to do is first just look at the photograph and think about whose perspective on the event are we getting here. So you're analyzing, looking at the details. The poster on the tractor says, "Skyrocketing food prices are cause for alarm, so help us save our family farm." So then you ask students to choose a word from a word bank that you give them. And this is where you can really differentiate for the grade that you teach. If I teach kindergarten, first grade, maybe I'm only going to offer 1 or 2 words, and I'm going to give simple feeling words that they know. If these words are probably appropriate for 3rd through 5th grade. If I teach middle school or high school, maybe I'm going to use words like opportunistic, devastated. So you're going to pick words that would be more meaningful to them. You choose a word, you think about why would they think that way? Why would the perspective represented in this photograph have that reaction to this event? So, for example, the perspective being presented in this photograph is the farmers. We're looking at one of the farmers and their tractor. So I might choose the word angry, and I might say the farmers were angry because they were losing their farms. And everybody would get to write down their idea, and then you could share it with a partner. You could share it out with the class and kind of keep track of the feelings that these farmers may have had. Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance to try it with this next photograph. So this is also a photograph taken during the rally. So the first thing you need to do is look at the photograph and think about whose perspective are we maybe getting from this photograph. So who is someone that you see? Which of the words in the word bank might represent their reaction, and why would they think that way? So on the last one, I said the farmers were angry because, and I used evidence from the photo, they were losing their farms. So when you have a sentence for this one, you can go ahead and share it in the chat. So someone noticed the police officer. The police officer appears neutral because he's focused on traffic and not the farm issues. Good. I also picked out the police officer and I said he might be concerned because the tractors seem to be causing problems in the city that he's having to deal with. The farmers were justified in going to Washington, D.C. because they're losing their farms. The farmers were concerned with the direction of prices and demanded action from Congress. Local residents were pleased that the protest was organized, so it appears organized. Maybe people are concerned about the safety. There's a police officer, they have it blocked, the road blocked off. And the police officer could be concerned because there's tractors in front of where the cars are trying to get through. Yeah, these are really great ideas. And do you see how we didn't all pick out the same perspective from the photograph? And even if we picked the same person, we chose different words and maybe different ways of thinking. So then you can start building your circle of viewpoints. So we picked out the farmers, the police, and there were some others that you mentioned. I just put these two on here to begin with, because the question then becomes who's involved, but also who is affected. So it's more than just the people doing the protest, but how's it affecting other people? And who might care about what's happening with the farmers or what's happening in the city? And then that's where our picture book comes in, because now we can say, well, what other viewpoints could we add? Are there people that we haven't seen in these photographs yet who were affected by the event? And we could ask questions from their point of view. So the book that matches these sources is one called Farmers Unite. And this book is written by Lindsay Metcalf, who actually lives on a family farm in Kansas. She grew up on a farm and knew some of the people that participated in this particular event. I actually learned about this book from a podcast that Tom Bober does. He interviewed her. And so she tells a lot of how if you're not familiar with his podcast, he interviews authors about where they found the primary sources for their books. And so you get a lot of good information on where to go to find sources from just listening to the authors or visiting their websites. because a lot of the resources I used with this, I got from her research that she shared on her website. So as we read the book, we're going to think about what new perspectives might we gain from the book. So again, I'm just going to share a few pages. The first page here I loved because since she's from Kansas, a lot of the people that she interviewed and the photographs that she uses are Kansas farmers. So this particular page shows a Kansas farmer, but the text says, "This is the worst traffic jam I've ever seen," a helicopter newsman told Kansas City radio listeners. So if we're thinking about who this affected, we get another perspective, the perspective of the newsman, what he was saying was going on. On this page of the book, it talks about the fact that traffic snarled, police scowled because there was so much traffic jam. And the very last sentence says, "They lost my vote," a man said of the farmers, after he arrived an hour late to work. And so that man there is a citizen of Washington, D.C. So even if you weren't participating in the rally, you were affected by what was going on. On this particular page, it talks about the fact that the tractors all chained themselves outside of the Department of Agriculture because they wanted their demands to be met. And so we get another perspective, the perspective of members of the government, the Department of Agriculture. And I think this is one of my favorite parts. The tractors were causing a lot of problems on the streets. They were causing problems on the National Mall. And so they decide that they should corral them into one area. So dump trucks and garbage trucks, buses, police cars, it says all corralled them like cattle. So not only were citizens just trying to get to work affected, but the city workers were taken away from their jobs to come in to try to help control the situation. And I think that kids would really connect to this one. So this one is not with the text, but it's just the photograph. Because if you look at the very bottom of the photograph and read the caption, it says that Dustin Covey, a Kansas 4-year-old, naps during a Senate Agriculture Committee hearing. So someone that you may not think about was the family members of the farmers, the little children that came, how they were affected. I just think that's a cute photo. And then President Carter was the president at the time of this event. So of course, what was his perspective on the event and what was he doing while it was happening? So after we read the text, then we can go back to our circle of viewpoints, or you may even want to be adding to it as you read each page. You could have this up and having kids come up and write the ideas, or you could be scribing it. Look at all the different perspectives that we gained from reading the book. And the great thing about that book is all the primary sources are already in the book. Instead of using hand-drawn illustrations, she decided to use actual photographs. So you already have this huge collection of primary sources already in the book, which also helps kids understand that this was a real event that happened. But you don't want to stop there, because the final step, if you remember from the previous screen, was that you want to add more perspectives. And I really think that these are protest buttons that she found that were linked to on her site, the author. And I think what's great about these is that it's a way to differentiate what you're looking at. For example, this protest button is probably not going to be understood by your kindergarten, first, second graders, but your older students that can understand what a POW is and the analogy that's being made could completely understand the perspective here. But for your younger students, maybe you want to look at this button and talk about why someone would wear it and what message is it sending. And then this is another protest button, which again, I think would really connect to your older students. Human rights for farmers too. And if you notice, the interior of that button is when they were corralling all of the tractors into one spot. And I just think that there would be a lot of connections and questions that students would ask. So as you're thinking about this strategy, this book, think about connections that you have. Could you use the book? Could you use the strategy? And I just think it's really important that we teach kids that there's a lot of perspectives to any event that happens. And the reason why I love picture books and primary sources is because oftentimes our social studies textbooks don't offer all of the viewpoints, and this helps students see, and that it's okay to change your mind. When they hear multiple perspectives, they may change their thinking from what they thought before. Exactly. And it teaches empathy because you're getting to see other people's feelings and not just that one. So if you have an event or a person that you can offer multiple perspectives, this is a great strategy. I'm just going to check the chat real quick to see lots of sources. And Justin, I'm going to have to look at what the name of the podcast is. I think it's the Primary Source Podcast, I think is what it's called. And I also just wanted to say this particular slide, I found so many resources related to this event. So I've linked some of them for you when you get the slides, because one of the other things that she does on her website is she links to a library in Kansas that has interviews with some of the farmers that were there. And so I think older students could really dive into those oral histories that they share and learn a lot from the perspectives that were there. That's at this Kinsley Library, and that's where a lot of the photographs came from as well. That library has a collection of interviews of people as well as the photographs that these individuals shared of not only that event, but the different protests that they participated in along the way.
I'm dying to know how long it took them to drive their tractor from Kansas to Washington, D.C. Have you run across that at all?
I know that it's in one of the sources, and it may have even been mentioned in the book. What's really interesting about the story is how it ends, because all these people are really upset that the tractors are messing up the National Mall and causing all these traffic jams. But there's a huge snowstorm that comes, and everyone gets stuck. And guess who comes to the rescue to get everybody out of the snow? It's the farmers and their tractors. And so in the end, it kind of flips the support, and people are supporting them, and it gets their message across. And I also didn't know Farm Aid is connected to this. So the Farm Aid, that they still actually have those concerts now as a result of their protest that raises awareness and funds for agriculture. So, a neat connection to Kansas history, because again, this book is written from Kansas, a Kansas farmer perspective, but also just a more current rural history, because we often think of history as being so long ago, and it helps kids see that history is just any study of the past. Okay, our final strategy that I'm going to share with you is called Zoom In Inquiry. So I have a photograph, and with this strategy, you just reveal parts of the photograph or the image at a time, and you ask students to make observations, reflect, what questions do they have? And then as you reveal each part of the image, it allows them to change their thinking, which again, you can kind of see as a common theme throughout all of the primary source strategies I chose this evening, that they all allow kids, as they get more information, to change their thinking and to learn that that's okay. So the first thing I want you to do, this is just one part of this photograph. And what ideas do you have about this photograph? And Nate says he knows, so he's not going to share. But everybody else, what is an idea that you have? Maybe something you see. Who do you think this person is? What are they doing?
I see some kind of bag draped over his shoulder, maybe.
Someone says a rail car worker. Oh, that's Nate. A uniform hat. Mm-hmm. And anytime you ask, it's a little bit harder in the chat, but anytime you're working with kids and you ask them to share an idea, you always want to follow up with, how do you know? Or what made you say that? So that they're providing evidence. So, it looks like a rail car worker. Okay, well, what made you say that? Maybe it's something in the background or part of his uniform. If you say that it's a uniform hat, well, what makes you think that's a uniform hat? So that they're always sharing evidence as well. Okay, so here is the next part of the photograph. So how has your thinking changed? Or is it confirming what you were thinking? So we have train car conductor, telegraph operator.
I kind of wonder if it's like a mailman.
What makes you say that?
The uniform and the really big bag and had the
Okay.
long handle that would drape across, like a lot of times they'd wear it across their chest, not down, but and I was
And
thinking it looks like it might be in the, 19th century just because of the style, the black and white.
your students, I mean, I know a lot of times the mail truck pulls up if your
Mhm.
mailbox is at the end of your driveway. But if you still have a mailbox that's attached to your house, kids may have even seen the mailman walking up to their house with a bag like that. So they might be able to make a connection. And it is a pretty big bag, so maybe it does have something to do with the mail. Okay, here is the final reveal. So what additional information does the complete photograph provide? Is your thinking changing? And also, what questions does this make you have now?
He's a stork. It's mail delivery of a baby.
The mail
Why was I
delivery.
putting that in the chat?
What'd you
Stork
say?
is a man. I was putting that in the chat. The stork is a man.
The stork is a man. I'm guessing that for most of us, that's a surprise, right? To see, we thought this was a mailman and now there's a baby in his bag. Nancy said, where's he taking that little kid, right? Like, why does he have a baby in his bag? And where's the mom? Is that his baby? Yeah, those are all good questions. And they both look so serious. Yes.
I've had a
Maybe
baby that big before, and carrying them that way is not going to be easy.
that
That's
wouldn't
a
have been.
heavy baby right there.
So one thing about this source that's different than the sources I shared with the other books is that the other sources were directly connected to the person or the event. They were primary sources that had a direct connection. This one actually is not, it's not a photograph of the person that we're going to read about in the book. It's not directly connected to the specific story that's told, but it is from the same time period and it's related to the story. So that's another way to think about primary sources. Early on, when I was working with primary sources, I always tried to find exactly a source that went with whatever we were studying. But sometimes you can think just about the context of the story or how it relates, sometimes even just a then and now. And so you want a source that connects to something now just so they can see the difference. So it's just a different way to think about using primary sources. So this goes along with the picture book that's called Mailing May, which is a story about a true story about a little girl named Charlotte May Pierstorff, who her parents wanted to send her to see her grandmother who lived 75 miles away. This took place in Idaho. And the only way to get her there would have been on the train, but a train ticket would have cost her parents a full day's pay. So instead of putting her on the train, they actually had her mailed to her grandmother. And she actually was mailed to her grandmother. So obviously, this is going to have inspire kids to ask a lot of questions, right? Like, how do you mail a person? And what's interesting about this picture book is it doesn't have primary source photographs or artifact images like some of the other books, but the images all have, like in this particular page, the illustrator has drawn an image based on a photograph. And this one talks about the parcel post, which will be important. This one just shows the stamps that were put on the mail, the parcel post before it was mailed. And she gets after they pay for her to be put on the mail train, she has these stamps put on the back of her because the man that works at the post office says, well, the rule book says nothing about children, but it is permissible to mail baby chicks. So he weighs her, and because she's in the weight limit of baby chicks, they mail her as they would baby chicks. And I like this particular page because there is the photograph of Charlotte, and there is one photograph that exists of her that's over on the right. And so you can see how the illustrator very much used the photograph of her to draw her in the book. And so after you read the story, obviously your kids are probably going to have a lot of questions about how it's possible to mail children. Can you mail children today? Might come up. So there were two main changes to the Postal Service that changed life for those living in rural America. The first one was rural free delivery. As you can see by the photograph here, this is a particular photograph was taken in Indiana in 1905. So rural free delivery service actually began in 1896, and it enabled mail to go directly to farm families. Before that, you would have to go to distant post offices, or you'd have to pay for private express companies to come to your house to deliver the mail. Free mail delivery began in cities in 1863, but it took more than 20 years for it to come to rural America. So that was the first thing that changed, but that still doesn't really help us understand how a child can be mailed. So the next big change that occurred was parcel post, which would enable you to send packages. So this particular article talks about that it could be anything under 11 pounds could now be mailed. And this was really important for rural America because they didn't have to take their produce to different places. They could now mail it as well, and they didn't have to add the price of transporting it. So with the combination of the rural free delivery and the parcel post, package service was now provided right from their mailbox if they lived in rural America. So we're still wondering about the little girl and mailing her. And so this particular article from 1920 talks about the fact it took quite a while, but she wasn't the only child that was mailed. It actually happened more than you would think. And so eventually the postmaster had to make a new law that said that you could not mail children, that unless it was a harmless live animal, which did not require food or water in transit, you could not be mailed. So that ended mailing children. And, they weren't like being put in a box. As you find from the story, there were mail cars on the train, and so they would sit. In the particular story of Charlotte, her uncle worked on the mail train, and so he agreed to take her, and she sat on the train with him, and the story goes into that. But I think children of any age would be fascinated by this story and the fact that at one point you could be mailed to your grandma's house. So that brings us to the end of our strategies. Today, our agenda was to answer two questions: why use primary sources, and then also why pair them with picture books. We also experienced 3 primary source strategies. We did the story before a story, we did the circle of viewpoints, and then we also did the zoom in inquiry. And then we also looked at some picture books that paired nicely with those particular primary sources that were related to rural histories, some local history here in Kansas, but then also the history of mail service and how it looked different in cities and rural areas. I just wanted to share with you that you can find me on X. There's my email. If any of the resources I didn't get linked, or you want more information about anything, I'm happy. Just reach out to me. I'm happy to share any of that. The QR code will take you to tonight's slides, which again have links in the notes to all the sources that I used. And if you have not seen my book yet, Making Time for Social Studies, it's available at Amazon or at Solution Tree. So at this time, didn't keep an eye on the chat there at the end, but if there were any questions that you have, and you can feel free to just unmute too if you have a question. Oh, I like Nancy talked about it's important to know their address. So just a life skill that you could connect with the book too with younger students.
Before we ask if anybody else has questions, I would like to hear from the group about maybe what your biggest takeaway is, or what is something that you can see either you personally benefiting from, like what are the wheels turning in your head, and or for those of you that work with the teachers specifically, how do you see yourself using this with teachers? I'd like to hear about what you're thinking.
Um,
Oh,
so
sorry.
I
Go
really,
ahead.
oh, sorry.
No, Michelle, go
No, go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry. Okay. I really, really, really love this, Rachel. I'm on spring break and I am on this call and I'm not disappointed. Okay. So that's the first thing. My mind is going insane because I was going to do a session on primary sources, of course, in secondary. And then I saw this. And now I'm very tempted. I love the strategies you use. And now I'm very tempted to do something utilizing these strategies, but trying to embed like maybe that first one, something more local for that area of our state or the city, and then using those same strategies and scaffolding them up and then telling like my middle school teachers, my high school teachers, like, no, I just did this session with the 3 through 5 teachers, and this was the difference. These were the differences I made. Like this was so good.
Oh, thank you. Julie Fishburne, who's also with us, she's the coordinator in my district, and we've kind of done something similar because we're working with all the elementary teachers on a resource adoption. And so we've just been training them. So we did a K2 and 3-5 and kind of did the same thing. We shared some of these strategies and talked about how could you use this picture book with K2, but then how could you use it with 3-5? So I love that. I love elementary social studies.
Well, I would love to pick your brain what it would look like in K2, because that's where my my pushback comes more, not 3-5. K through 2 is like, ooh, no.
Well, our K2 teachers were pretty excited and they've already given us some great ideas too. So yeah, we'll
Oh,
have to connect.
yes, Rachel, this was awesome.
Thank you.
Nate,
I
what were
was
you going to say? Oh, sorry, Julie, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I didn't mean to cut you off there. I was just going to say, I think our K2 teachers were probably the most excited group because they could see that when you say primary sources, you don't necessarily mean text. So it's a great, easy, quick way to get kids who are kindergarten, first and second graders who aren't readers yet to analyze primary sources. And they were so excited. They left and started using some of the strategies the very next day. Rachel and I were getting emails. And so that was really cool just to see them get so jazzed up about social studies, which is amazing. And doing social studies every day.
But I think the key takeaway from my point of view is the disarming accessibility of these strategies, that students don't feel pressured to, or like they're on under a spotlight to provide answers, but at the same time, you're providing that access. And I think it was Tina that said, even with some of these picture books, you might use them in a middle school or even a secondary setting to provide ease of access for students. And again, it's disarming. You don't feel under pressure. You're just taking what you've got, and everybody's doing at the same level. We're all in the same boat, so to speak. And so I love that. I think once, to Michelle's point and to Julie's, the idea that elementary teachers, K2, 3, 5, whoever it happens to be, feel pressured to incorporate these heavy texts. And then when they know that the primary sources are a multitude, it doesn't have to be something like the Declaration of Independence or some massive speech. It could just be an image of a farmer in Washington, D.C., or it might even be a music file and listening to a primary source. So
I also posted a source set from the Library of Congress for kindergarten through second grade. So you might want to take a look at those. Also, there's a great kindergarten inquiry that when I was a social studies coordinator, I used with kindergarten teachers in maybe first grade. And it's basically the mail service. And it was the mail service from like 100 years ago. So there's like a little 1 minute video they can watch of the mail service. There's some postcards, photographs in there about what the mail service is about. And so it's really, it's written out as a blog, but embedded within the blog are links out to these sources that are housed on the library's website. And that kindergarten one, even though it says kindergarten, is really fun for any grade when you look at the then and the now. So we kind of use that as a jumping off point for then and now with, well, if we can do this at the post office, what can we do then and now with police officers or then and now with fire trucks and those kinds of things. So it was a quick way to get jump started on that and really accepting the idea that those primary sources are photographs too.
I'll also say that my book highlights how to create units, but it also has created units in it. And there are units around topics for K2 and 3-5. So for example, one of the K2 units that already has links to primary sources is a then and now, and it compares libraries from the past to now. It highlights the woman that started the first bookmobile, and it also highlights another woman that started children's libraries in libraries so that children could check out books. So if you're looking for some K2 resources and any strategy that's shared in my book, I also share how you can scaffold it down for K2 or up for 3-5. So it's definitely a book for K through 5. And then any of them you could take and scaffold up for middle school or high school.
Justin, what are you thinking?
So, my area of expertise is secondary. So one of the challenges I have is finding the picture books, to pair with the topics, because that's not my area. So I've just been sitting here thinking, like, what process could I use to maybe partner with teachers to develop text sets that have picture books, and then with my expertise with primary sources, build those sets. So I've just kind of been thinking through that as y'all have been talking.
So I know you said you're reading my book. There is a section when you get to the secondary sources that gives you some places to look for picture books. One of them is from NCSS. They have their notable trade book list every year, so I get ideas from there. Tom Bober that I was talking about, he has a website where he has picture books already paired with primary sources, so I go there. Oftentimes what I do when I'm looking for a primary source or a picture book is I just search a picture book about this person or a picture book about this topic. And then sometimes I'll go and look at those other lists to see if it's a book that's kind of already been vetted through NCSS. So then I know that it's probably true to the actual history of the story. But that's one way that I find picture books is sometimes I just search for a picture book. But there's also some curated list in my book.
I also think those elementary librarians would love to help you out with that. So if you just picked up the phone and asked them, you'd be like, oh, I've got this and I've got this, and they would love to share what they have. That could be a good way to do it too, especially if you're saying, I would like something nonfiction. Chances are that if they had something nonfiction that was a 32-page children's picture book. It probably has primary sources embedded in the back, like Rachel was saying earlier. And so that could be a really great way. And they could just inner office it to you.
Mhm.
Kaylin, what are you thinking? By the way, I'm so happy to see you here.
I'm so happy to be here. Um, I use so many picture books in my classroom. It's not even funny, but I love the idea of pairing it with primary sources. I think I was super interested when I saw that this was going on because that's what I like. I use picture books all the time. And so I'm excited to like get started with this tomorrow. Like we're learning about the national anthem as part of like a symbol. And so I was looking on one of the websites that you had put in the chat and it said like state symbols and I was like, this is great. So I'm very excited.
I love to hear that. I would also encourage you to think about the picture books you use in other content areas. I pair primary sources with the picture books I use in science. I do it in math. And so it enables me sometimes to teach a little bit of history or content, even when I'm teaching science or math. And it also enables us just to practice primary source analysis, even though it's not our social studies part of the day.
That's awesome. Yeah, I will for sure look into that.
Mila, what are you thinking? Because you said your early childhood, right? Or in primary grades, maybe?
Yes, I'm early childhood. I think like all of us is amazing, especially just because like as we've talked before, like early childhood, they can't really, they're still learning to read. It's kind of difficult for them. So using a lot of like pictures, like the zoom in strategy, I really love just because you can use a picture and they can tell you all about it, and they love to tell you everything that they know or that they're wondering.
That is absolutely true. Does anybody else have any questions for Rachel or about any of these strategies or where to get sources or anything about books?
Rachel, do you do any professional development? Do you travel to do professional development? Because I know with Nichelle and myself being so close together, we would love to host you.
Yeah, you can you have my book on the inside. It talks about how you can contact Solution Tree if you're interested in professional
Oh,
development.
you're already part of the vendor group. Oh, this makes me happy. Yes, Justin, I will. Let's talk.
You're smiling so big, Rachel, my cheeks hurt. I told
Well,
y'all she was great.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you, because I know a lot of you have shared you're on your spring break. So I think that's really neat that you were willing to do some professional development while you're on break. So thank you so much. Thank you for all the positive feedback. I love hearing that this is just, I try to promote as much elementary social studies as I can. And a special thank you to Tina. I appreciate her so much because she has taught me a lot of what I know. The story before story strategy I shared, I learned that from Tina. So she is always willing to share. She's invested a lot in me. So thank you, Tina, for allowing me to be a part of this. This was great.
I adore you, friend. I'm so glad that you're here. Okay, so the last thing that we have up, and if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to drop in the chat or just unmute here in just a second. But I did want to let you know about an upcoming webinar, our next one that we're going to have. First of all, I want to let you know that this webinar tonight, we're going to make it available to you and all your friends. I'm going to load it to our YouTube channel, and I'll make sure that you get an email straight from me either later tonight or tomorrow that has this video already embedded in it, including the slide deck that some of you were asking for. But please mark your calendars to get ready for our next webinar with Valencia Abbott. She's an award-winning high school teacher from Wentworth, North Carolina, and she's going to be talking about history in our backyard, amplifying rural histories through inquiry and primary sources. And so in this session, Valencia, who's also a veteran teacher, will uncover rural contributions to American history by highlighting the civil rights movement beyond 1968 by focusing on Griggs versus the Duke Power Company. And also peek at upcoming projects such as the Race to the Dam that is part of the America 250 celebration, where participants are going to learn how to encourage students and community members to explore primary sources, fostering a deeper understanding of how this impacts the narrative for state, national, and global historical contexts. And participants will also learn how to preserve their local history by documenting and sharing their stories in their own backyard by learning tips and tricks for how to do so in any community. So we hope that you join us on Monday, April 7th, 2025 from 6 to 7:30. And real quick, so I don't forget, I'm going to drop that link in the chat so that you can register right now if you want to be a part of that. And if you already know you have a conflict and can't make it, you sign up there, then you'll get the email from me with the link to it when it is over. So again, we'll stick around for a few, as long as you want to stick around for if you've got questions, but otherwise, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Rachel, for sharing your expertise, and we hope to see you all in April.